in the chat box. We are again happy to offer automated closed captioning services for this event. They're real-time captions that will run simultaneously with the presentation. Jason has posted this link to access the streaming text in the chat box. When using the closed captioning feature, we recommend you opening a second window with the link provided and resizing it in such a fashion that it appears below the webinar screen. This allows the viewer to see both the webinar and its associated text and graphics while also being able to comfortably view the real-time captions. If you have any questions about the closed captioning option, we have posted the Civil Rights Coordinator email address in the chat box, and you could select it there. Next slide. I will now pass this to Dr. Alyssa Ward, who is our Virginia Medicaid Behavioral Health Clinical Director, to introduce our guest speakers. Dr. Ward?
Thank you so much, Ashley, and thank you to all of you who are here today. I can see there are 483 of you who are joining us for this very important conversation. Virginia Medicaid provides health coverage to millions of Americans, including eligible low-income adults, children, pregnant women, elderly adults, and people with disabilities. In Virginia, Medicaid plays a critical role in the lives of 1.5 million Virginians, providing access to health care for the most vulnerable populations. The impact of Medicaid extends far beyond traditional health coverage to include comprehensive services, including behavioral health services and long-term services and supports. Medicaid is the largest payer of behavioral health services in the Commonwealth, providing inpatient and outpatient services that support quality of life in the community for those who need such supports. It is also the primary funder for long-term services and supports, making it possible for thousands of Virginians to remain in their homes or to access residential care when needed. DMAS's mission is to improve the health and well-being of Virginians through access to high-quality health care coverage. Our values as an agency dictate that we not only prioritize but ensure a deep commitment to racial equity and inclusion on the part of the agency, its partners, and its contractors. Inherent in this mission is a commitment to ensuring that all those who partner or deliver care to our members do so in a way that makes certain that every individual is treated with dignity and respect. Director Karen Kimsey and the executive team here at Virginia's Medicaid program believe strongly, as do I, that this training, including the portions related to race-related disparities in the delivery of medical services, is in furtherance of that mission. We hope this presentation will foster conversations around health disparities and equity in all healthcare services, including substance use disorder treatment. I would like to introduce our wonderful presenters today. The title of this presentation is Uncomfortable Conversations on the Couch, Racial Trauma and Incorporating Culturally Sensitive Practices. We are so honored to have these two psychologists with us today, Dr. Dougan and Dr. Walden. In 2012, these two psychologists met while working with juvenile offenders at Beaumont Juvenile Correction Center. Over the next 5 years, they became good friends and colleagues, and although physically working in different parts of the state, they grew together through a passion for positive client-centered treatment. And in 2017, they opened their own practice. They focus on providing positive interventions to individuals in the greater RVA area based on culturally sensitive practice. They envision a future that endeavors to integrate the best treatment interventions for each individual. Dr. Dougan, Dr. Walden, thank you so much for being here today and having this conversation with us.
Thank you, everybody. Welcome to our presentation. We are very happy to be here. I'm Dr. Dougan.
And I'm Dr. Walden. So before we get started today, we just wanted to kind of talk a little bit about how we got to having the opportunity to provide this presentation. Back in April, Dr. Dougan and I began having several conversations between us, as well as other clinicians in our practice. Those individual conversations built to us having meetings within our clinic as a group to discuss what was going on. By the time we started to hit summer, we were also having other conversations with colleagues in the community. At that time, we were asked if we would be willing to sit on kind of a roundtable discussion talking about racial trauma and culturally sensitive practices. From those conversations, it grew into the presentation that we're going to present to you today.
Right, and so let's just address the elephant in the room. The conversation is about racial trauma. And so we just want to address the fact that it's going to be very sensitive information, and we understand this. We also understand that many of you have been having these conversations since the beginning of the year. And we just want to continue that growth and continue these conversations. Images are going to be very important in this presentation. And so this first image represents people having those intimate conversations, and also our hope that we can all be reflective on our own views on racial trauma and our roles in incorporated culturally sensitive practices. So we just hope that you sit back, enjoy the conversation. Dr. Walden and I are both Medicaid providers, and we have a profound respect for the work that you do. But we just really want to get some growth out of these presentations. Martin Luther King Jr. says it best when he says, "Nothing in the world is more dangerous than sincere ignorance and conscientious stupidity."
So before we kind of get started, just kind of some disclaimers. So Dr. Dougan and I don't represent DMAS or CMS. We are both clinical psychologists who primarily work in private practice. We don't represent the APA or any other state or national association. Also, we don't have any commercial interest in this presentation. We don't have any books that we're going to sell or anything like that at the end. At this time, we do want you to know that we will be adding our perspective based on the conversations that we've had, and trying to also provide some clinical research and to provide a better understanding. And at the end, we'll be asking you for kind of your opinions and your thoughts on the presentation today. So just kind of a quick overview of our hopes for today. So first, we're going to provide you with the general goals of what we're talking about. Then we're going to talk about racial trauma, anti-blackness, and white privilege. We hope to provide you a little bit of history on these topics, as well as some definitions to help with the vocabulary in order to have conversations regarding these topics, and current factors of where we are at today regarding them. That we're going to bridge into some general ideas of awareness and therapeutic competencies. And we hope to attach that to a holistic approach to practice when working with culturally diverse populations. So just kind of quickly here, we're going to be looking at our goals. So first, hopefully we're going to provide you some historical context on racial biases and white privilege. We hope that we're going to be able to raise some awareness regarding current issues around racism and prejudice. We also are going to hopefully be able to provide you some clinical application to what we can do as clinicians as far as providing sensitive treatment. And then additionally, we hope that the impact of the culturally sensitive treatment for individuals and how we can apply that specifically to individuals with a substance use disorder.
Okay, so we wanted to give you our working definition of racial trauma. Racial trauma is a form of race-based stress. It refers to people of color and Indigenous individuals' reactions to dangerous events and real or perceived experiences of racial discrimination. Such experiences may include threats of harm and injury, humiliating and shaming events, and witnessing racial discrimination toward other people of color. Although similar to post-traumatic stress disorder, racial trauma is unique in that it involves ongoing individual and collective injuries due to exposure and re-exposure to race-based stress. So it's based on race. The stress is based on race. It involves exposure to race-based stress and re-exposure, and it can be based on individual and collective injuries. So as we said earlier, images are going to be important throughout this presentation. And this first image can kind of give you an example or an idea of how racial trauma works. We are constantly bombarded with triggers in our environment that trigger, race-based stress. So with this first image, it is a depiction of a slave ship, and it shows how slaves were transported during slavery, captured and transported. So here, what we want you to do is just sort of take inventory of how you're feeling and assess how you're feeling while looking at this image. You might ask yourself, how does this image make me feel? And how would I feel? How would these feelings change if the people on this ship were white? So we have outlined some of the history. We're not going to go through everything because there is a lot of history. However, initially when these topics started coming up, we realized there was a question we kept getting. It was like, how come all the protesters are so angry all of a sudden? And so we realized not everybody is going to connect the American history with what's happening now. And so there is a need to kind of reflect back on some of the history. But before I go into the history, I do want to bring your attention to the image on the left, and it is a picture of a slave, and around him it says, "Am I not a man and a brother?" And we will see this statement or question repeatedly throughout this presentation. So here we outline history starting from colonization, and we talk about the growth of slavery, and then we talk about the 13th Amendment. We want to focus a little bit on the 13th Amendment as it freed slaves. However, it ensured that Blacks would remain inferior and suppress their power. If Blacks didn't know their place, they would lose their freedom. Whites were taught white supremacy. The image and the creation of the image of Blacks as savages happened. There were many lynchings, beatings, torturing of Black people, and segregation, and the development of the KKK, or the Ku Klux Klan. And here we just have some other examples of the oppression of Blacks in this country, with the destruction of the Black Wall Street, zoning laws and redlining, and the affirmative action ban. We also wanted to pull out the civil rights movement separately, just simply because it was a lengthy period of time where peaceful protest was met with unnecessary intimidation or force. We specifically wanted to point out the Memphis sanitation strike in 1968 and bring your attention also to this image. The sanitation strike occurred in, it was sanitation workers' response to inhumane working conditions that resulted in the death of some sanitation workers. And here we also have that image or that statement, I am a man, you know, I am valuable, I am human. Here we have another timeline, and I like this timeline because although it leaves out important details such as the development of the KKK and violence against Blacks, it really shows the migration or demonstrates the migration of racism in this country. And it talks about, it depicts slavery during slavery, how Blacks were treated as property. Then it gets into the Jim Crow and segregation era where Blacks were treated as second-class citizens. And up until today, where we're still dealing with racial inequities and still living with the effects of structural racism. And so throughout this timeline, we can all see the inhumane or mistreatment of Blacks. These are just some additional definitions that we wanted you to have. If you've had any sort of multicultural training, you've seen these definitions, but we just wanted you to have them for your knowledge.
With the history, we also want to look at what are the current factors that are involved. So a big one is the difference in life expectancy. So the life expectancy of a Black American versus a white American is a difference of about 3.6 years. And if you begin to control for education and socioeconomic status, that discrepancy increases.
Yeah, so keep in mind, we're talking about racial trauma here, and we're talking about examples of racial trauma. And so school discrepancies is a big factor on that list. And so here's some stats. By kindergarten, Black American children perform worse on reading and arithmetic tasks than white children. Through the 8th grade, the gap in standardized testing continues to grow. We'll come back to this gap. In a North Carolina County study, 160,000 students were cited for violating school policy. Black students counted for 55% of the days suspended, but only counted for 31% of the population. Suspensions were given at 3 times the rate to Black students as white students. High school dropout rates are 6.3% for Black Americans and 4.1% for white Americans. College enrollment for Black Americans was 44% and 72% for white Americans. So again, we're speaking of racial trauma, and we just want to make this relatable. If you are the parent of a Black child, you know, imagine how that would work. You know, just by sending your child to school, the odds are against your child in terms of resources that they may have or achievement that they may have, or even how they're treated. And so, you know, that can really, really, really impact children and parents. School is supposed to be one of the safest places you go.
And as Dr. Dougan mentioned, talking about ability to get to resources, when individuals are adults, we also see this discrepancy in income. In 2009, Black males made about an average of $23,700, while white males made $36,700, which is a difference of about $13,000 annually, or a little over $1,000 a month. So if you think about what you're able to obtain or do with your paycheck or your income every month, and then all of a sudden we take $1,000 away from that. How does that disadvantage you in comparison to what you could do the previous month? And now we want to talk a little bit about anti-blackness. So this is the idea that there is a resistance or push back against the idea or values of Black individuals in this country. It's the opposition or hostility towards people who are Black.
Right. So again, anti-blackness is sort of this idea that, racial discrimination can be narrowed down even further to Blacks in this country, as there's all this history behind it that stems from slavery. Kendi has examples of how anti-blackness can be expressed. And so we're not going to go through all of these, but we'll go through some of these. The first we want to go through is biology. A biological racist is one who is expressing the idea that races are meaningfully different in their biology, and that these differences create a hierarchy of value. So we talked about the achievement gap earlier, and so some of you may be familiar with the very controversial bell curve, where authors purported that in addition to social and environmental factors, that the achievement gap between Blacks and white students is caused by deficits in IQ, and that these deficits in IQ are influenced by race. The other two I wanted to go through are body and behavior. A bodily racist is one who is perceiving certain racialized bodies as more animal-like and violent than others. A behavioral racist is one who is making individuals responsible for perceived behavior of a racial group, and making racial groups responsible for the behavior of individuals. And so a good example of this is the movie or the film When They See Us. For those of you that don't know, this film is about 5 young men who were wrongly accused of and convicted of beating and raping a white woman in Central Park in the late 80s, early 90s. And so the film does a really good job of showing the contrast between how these children actually were, which were children, and how their families and communities saw them, which were as children, and how the law enforcement or the media depicted them.
Another one that we wanted to point out is space racism, which is the idea or movement of an equity between races based on space. And there's a couple of times that we can kind of see this that I want to point out in history. One is during World War II, when individuals were asked to move to the San Francisco area to build ships for the Pacific Fleet. And at that time, the government was offering housings to individuals and their families who would come out and do this. However, the government divided the area into white housing and Black housing, which created a growing inequity over time, because the land value where they were providing white housing during this time increased in value greater than it did in the area where they built Black housing. Additionally, in large cities, we also see this. So as using New York as an example, as more and more individuals want to live in the city, individuals are actually pushed out of their homes either by taxes or landlords or other factors in which the growing cost makes it so that they are unable to stay and live where they are. And this creates a divide between the white community and the Black community based on space.
Yes, and briefly, we wanted to talk about gender, racism, and sexuality. And what we wanted to do here was just point out that, many individuals have other factors in their lives that compound their experience of discrimination. And a lot of these individuals don't even have the verbiage or the words to express what they are going through.
Now, looking at a little history related to anti-blackness. So the first thing that we want to point out is in the 1700s, there was the creation of the slave patrols. And this was when white individuals were allowed or placed on patrol to make sure that Black individuals were not in areas or neighborhoods where they weren't wanted. Also, in the 1890s, there were creation of grandfather clauses, which states used to prevent people from being able to vote or register to vote based on paying taxes or owning property, which limited individuals' ability to have independence and cast votes in elections. From there, we want to move forward kind of into the Nixon era, 1971, the war on drugs. The war on drugs created an inequity within the prison system of the number of individuals who were incarcerated based on this idea of war on drugs. That was built upon in the 1990s during the Clinton era, when we had the Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act, which basically militarized the police system and kind of pushed more and more into this war on drugs type scenario. And then we also wanted to point out in 2012, the Stand Your Ground law of Florida, when George Zimmerman killed Trayvon Martin. So if we think back to the 1700s and the period of slave patrols, and we move all the way forward into the 2000s, while we change the name of it, we're still seeing the same type of behaviors from individuals.
Okay, so here we want to go over some specific definitions related to anti-Blackness. And the first is dehumanization, and it is the denial of full humaneness to others and the cruelty and suffering that accompany it. A practical definition refers to it as the viewing and treatment of other persons as if they lack mental capacity that we enjoy as human. The second one is projection, which is a defense mechanism in which the human ego defends itself against unconscious impulses or qualities. We talked about this earlier when we were talking about the projection of negative images onto Black bodies. On the next slide, we'll also talk about thingification, which is a step further than dehumanization, where people are viewed as not human, not people, not animals, just as being void of feelings and human or any lifelike quality. And so if we think about the case of George Floyd, when you think about that, you might ask yourself, like, what is a person going through that they cannot recognize that this human being is suffering to the point of death? I ask, which of these concepts here played a role in that? When you think of Ahmaud Arbery, you might ask yourself, like, what would make a person view someone who is dressed in jogging attire and jogging in broad daylight? What would make someone view that person as a threat to their community? I would ask myself, which of these concepts play a role in that situation?
Then another one that we want to point out is Afro-pessimism, which is the idea or the framework that places Black identity or Black views as less than white identity or white views. So this can be seen in everything from the way marketing campaigns are done to the way that people's body forms or images are viewed within the United States. So this includes everything from the subjective differences and personal differences, in addition to the way individuals have lived experiences and differences. A couple that we want to point out here, because Dr. Dougan had talked about thingification. The first one is post-traumatic slave syndrome. And this is the multi-generational impact and traumas that are experienced by Black individuals that lead to kind of this repeated trauma and stress that they experienced, even though it is undiagnosed. We also want to talk about dysphoria, and this is the idea that individuals actually may have negative attitudes, behaviors, or mannerisms towards Black individuals, and possibly even to the degree where it's a dissociation or other types or presentation of a psychological disorder. And so we wanted to bring back up this slide again, looking at the timeline. So if we look at this, when we talk about anti-Blackness, when we think of this, we move from a slave era to the Jim Crow segregation era to racial inequality. And if we look, even though we're changing the name of what's going on, the behaviors and the interactions that are going on are staying the same. So we want to begin to think of, like, are we actually making a change, or are we simply trying to rename it? So this way, if we think that it's doing something better. So let's look at some of the current factors here related to anti-Blackness. So the first one is if we just look at poverty in general. So about 26% of Black families live below the poverty line, while only about 10% of white families are living below the poverty line.
When we look at prisons, African Americans make up 6% of the population, but 40% of the prison population. 98.4% serving life sentences under law provision are African American. 75% of those in prison for drugs are either African American or Hispanic. There are more African American males in the criminal justice system presently than enslaved in 1850.
When we look at substance use disorders, African American and Hispanic males are about 20% less likely to complete both treatment programs as well as residential treatment. So we have to begin to ask ourselves, like, what's going on here that we're starting to see these discrepancies? So first, we want to look at just the rate of substance use disorders. So it occurs in about 9.5% in African American and Black Americans, and about 9% in white Americans. So very similar. But when we begin to look at the treatment completion rates, only about 11% of Black Americans are completing treatment, while close to 0.5% or half of white Americans are completing treatment. So what could this difference be?
So when we look at factors associated with retention, criminal justice coercion and case management resulting in reentry into prison is the strongest variable. So we're looking at harsher punishments for relapse for Blacks than for whites. We're looking at the very person that's supposed to be coordinating your care having to report you to your PO. And then there's a subsequent mistrust in the system by African Americans. There's also a lack of availability of treatment approaches that address systemic problems among the African American population. Okay, so some other statistics we wanted to just go over is that in 2017, among non-Hispanic Blacks, the opioid-related overdose death rate was 12.9 deaths per 100,000 people. It was the third highest opioid-related overdose death rate compared to other races or ethnicities. In 2017, non-Hispanic Blacks had the highest percentage of opioid-related overdose deaths and total drug deaths attributed to synthetic opioids when compared to other races or ethnicities and the national population. In 2017, though Black Americans represented 12% of the US adult population. They made up a third of the sentenced prison population. In 2012, they accounted for 38% of the sentenced prison population in the US and 39% of the population incarcerated for drug-related offenses. So it seems to be harsher punishments for Blacks around substance use disorder and substance-related offenses.
We also wanted to take a little bit of time to look at racial discrepancies related to the lethality of law enforcement. So first, when looking at victims of police brutality, white Americans make up about 50%, and Black Americans make up about 30% or a third. So while white Americans may be higher by percentage, the percentage of the individual ethnic groups is kind of incongruent there. So we want to look at what's going on. So when we look at fatalities, it's about 2.8 times higher among Blacks than whites, even though Black individuals are far less likely to be armed when lethal force is used by law enforcement.
Other findings, when Black and Hispanic drivers are more likely to be pulled over, ticketed, and searched during traffic stops. Blacks experience disproportionately higher arrest rates and are 3 times more likely to experience any use of force. And again, in order to relate to this, think about Black parents. Or parents of Black children. If you're the parent of a white child and you're putting your child on the road for the first time, you're already concerned about safety. You may tell them to wear their seatbelt. You may tell them, to take driver's ed. You may prepare them that way. If you're the parent of a Black child, there are other conversations that you have that driver's ed will not prepare your child for. To include, the possibilities when you get pulled over.
So to kind of give us a model so we can kind of conceptualize what is going on here. So this is taken from Latinx immigration community, but the idea or the model still applies. So when trauma occurs, right, it can affect an individual and the community. So here, if an individual has a substance use disorder problem or is experiencing a trauma, that can also impact their family. Also, if there's an individual in the family who is experiencing the problem, this can also impact the individual, as well as the overall dynamic that's the overall dynamic between the family and the individual can also have an impact on the community at large. And all of it, the individual, the family, and the community are impacted by the laws and policies that are governing them or providing an equity to them. So this here just kind of gives us a visualization of what is going on.
So Black Lives Matter, the statement. At the top of the year when we were having conversations about racial trauma, racial inequities, Black Lives Matter came up. And Black Lives Matter, we had a lot of discussion around Black Lives Matter, and here are some of the questions that came up for us. Is this statement a political or human rights issue? Are policy and politics embedded in issues around race? Do racial wounds occur in a socio-political context? Can we separate behavioral health from politics if we are to be thorough? Do politics impact behavioral health? So here we are at the top of 2020, and we have Ahmaud Arbery, we have George Floyd, we have Breonna Taylor, we have Jacob Blake, and then we have the verdict around Breonna Taylor. And so we still have this need for this statement. I am a man, I'm human, I'm valuable. Okay, so Black Lives Matter, the movement. This came out about in 2013 after the verdict of the acquittal of George Zimmerman. And it developed as a way of rehumanizing Blacks in response to a growing list of unarmed Black males being killed by police officers. It represents that when Black lives matter, all lives matter. And it's also a means of protesting systemic racism and racist policy and advocating for the development of anti-racist policy. And so again, one of the reasons we had the history, we speak about the history is to kind of show how there's been this history of racist policy that assist with the treatment of Blacks as inferior and the lack of anti-racist policy. And so the Black Lives Matter movement is one of the goals of the organization is to assist with that. But the Black Lives Matter movement has been met with much resistance, such as we saw during the civil rights movement, where peaceful protests are met with unnecessary force or intimidation. And so Hooker wanted to sort of look at reasons for Black Lives Matter resistance. And so Hooker talked about the concept that Black Lives Matter is not indicative of crisis, but rather politics as usual is a modern day form of racism and a means to silence Blacks into an inferior position. Hooker also talks about the concept that Black anger is not a legitimate response to racial terror and violence, is possibly one of the things that contributes to Black Lives Matter resistance. There's also a concept of peaceful acquiescence to democratic loss, such as seen in the civil rights movement. Right? So there's this idea that although the system has been failing us throughout history, that we are still supposed to believe in the system. Angela Davis addresses this and says it best in her quote. Black liberation must entail ways of contesting the absolute authority of the law, because the law can and does act to reproduce injustice and inequality.
So in the early times of the civil rights movement, only about 20% or so of white Americans supported the civil rights movement. Here we have pictures from like 2013 to 2020, all across the United States and Europe and England and Paris and as far away as Australia. So this here has become quite a big change for all of us, from a time when few supported Black rights to now, it's now an international movement that the sun is not setting on. We know that we've been discussing some pretty heavy topics so far, and we have a few more kind of heavy topics to continue talking about. But we want to offer everybody a little bit of a break here just to kind of process what's going on and have ability to stretch a little bit and walk around in preparation for the next section. So if you'd like to take about 5-10 minutes or so, we'll meet back at about 4 o'clock and continue our conversation. Hello, we want to welcome everybody back as we continue this conversation. I'll get it. There we go. Sorry, getting rid of some black background noise. So now we want to kind of shift our perspective a little bit. So the first part, we were talked a lot about racial trauma and anti-blackness, but now we want to talk a little bit about white privilege. So white privilege is the inherent advantages given to white people based solely on race and within society, and which creates racial inequalities and injustices. So the first definition that we kind of wanted to point out on its own is this idea of privilege. So these are rights, advantages, or immunities that are granted to particular individuals, in this case, white individuals, over other people or other groups. So one thing that we need to point out is whiteness. So this definition has kind of changed over time, but the basic construct is that it's a system of racism that creates inequity between groups, and basically is a false construct that allows one group, white individuals, certain privileges over other groups like Black individuals. This is done through superiority. So superiority is a set or a hierarchy where one individuals are placed at the top and other individuals are placed beneath them, which creates inequity and provides privilege to the higher caste.
The next concept is unspoken white solidarity. And solidarity on a basic level is just unity as a group or a class that produces or is based on community of interest, objectives, and standards, right? But to give you an example of how this may work, let's talk about our fictitious client, Loretta. Loretta is a woman of color. She works for a Fortune 500 company. She's been working there for some years. And from the beginning, her goal has been to climb the corporate ladder. And she was able to do that up until the point to where she is now. She is continuing to try to move up, but feels as though her white counterparts are being given opportunities that she is not, and people with similar skill or lesser skill are surpassing her. Her peers are leaving her out of important meetings that would contribute to her advancement. And when she talks to her superiors about it, they are not responding in a way that's providing her with any answers. Loretta is, getting increasingly frustrated. She feels as though her white counterparts have a unspoken solidarity. They know that they're not going to allow her to move up, and they're going to sort of stick together in helping each other move past the point where she is. She has noticed an increase in her drinking at night at this point. She has increased her drinking from 1 to 2 glasses a night to maybe a bottle or more. And she comes into the office due to this. And we'll get back to Loretta in a few. So dueling consciousness is another term, and we can piggyback off of white solidarity. Dual consciousness is this concept that there's a vacillation between ideas of segregation and ideas of assimilation, right? So there's this idea that assimilating with other groups can be beneficial during some times, but then during other times when it compromises superiority, maybe not. And so an example of this is, I am friends with Black people on my sports team, and it's okay for them to be on my sports team. But once they get into my neighborhood, then I start to worry that they're going to bring down the value of my neighborhood.
Another important definition is aversive racism. So sometimes people might call this like covert racism. So instead of being overtly racist, this is an individual who harbors beliefs or ideas that are racist and are prejudiced towards other individuals. Kind of an example of this would be as an individual who may tell racist jokes or may make subtle racist comments around other white friends. Additionally, we also want to point out white fragility, which this is the discomfort that individuals feel or defensiveness individuals feel when talking or being confronted with their own white privilege or the ideas of racial inequity. So a lot of times as we're having these conversations today, there may be individuals who feel uncomfortable about it, and that can be part of our own white fragility.
Okay, so the concept of color blindness. This is the belief that racial group membership should not be taken into account or even noticed, right? So we don't see color. And color blindness came about years ago, and it was actually supposed to be a positive thing, right? Like we're all equal, we're all the same. But what we've noticed is that as the years has gone by, color blindness has been used to, say that I am not racist and I don't see color. However, if you don't see color, there's no way to address racism or discrimination. And so what we're seeing is that this concept has actually perpetuated racism. There's also this concept that D'Angelo talks about. It's called the good-bad binary. And this is the concept that upholding racist ideas is immoral, right? And this lends to the idea that racism equates to blatant forms of racism. And so if one thinks that a racist is only one who does blatantly racist acts, then it's easy for them to separate themselves from racism versus looking at racism as a system that we are all socialized to believe white as superior. And so we all need to kind of be reflective and see how we may be contributing to racist ideas.
And another definition, assimilation, is important. Kendi kind of just pointed this out as the belief that other like races, cultures, or behaviors are inferior to the superior kind of white ideal, and that in order to progress or to develop, those cultures must be assimilated or brought into, or an individual must change more into the white dominant culture in order to have success. So when we talk about the about white privilege, we want to bring up the prejudice hypothesis. So Bobo and Zabrinsky in 1996 had a meta-analysis that basically showed that racism is institutionalized and that this segregation continues. And they based this on a pattern of discrimination around the housing market. And basically it showed that this type of difference supported the idea of the prejudice hypothesis, and that there's a difference between in groups and out groups, between white individuals and Blacks.
So one of the questions that keeps coming up for us in our own discussions about racism and racial trauma at our practice is, can we challenge racist ideas in therapy.
And a couple of individuals have looked at this. Bell and Goldman both kind of looked at this idea. So Bell looked at it as that there's a pathological form of racism, kind of motivated by arson and hate crimes, institutionalized poverty, and it constitutes a public health concern. Goldman, a psychiatrist, went even farther and hypothesized that racism was actually a presentation of a psychological disorder or a personality disorder. He went on further to hypothesize that even things such as sexism, ageism, and heterosexism may be a manifestation of these symptoms. So people's paranoias, personality disorders, these symptoms may actually present as racism. We also wanted to look at kind of some of the white privilege history. And so if we look back over the history that we've presented so far, if we looked at the other side of it, the majority of that would be the white privilege side of things. But we feel that images may give us a better understanding of how this exists in US culture. And when looking at ads from the 1950s, we see that all, if not all, the majority specifically pointed out the white privilege, from what an individual house may look like, or what being in the suburbs may be, or even going on vacation. It shows all the forms of white privilege in the United States.
Okay, so now that we have all of this information, how do we get to culturally sensitive practice, right? And so first we want to start on an individual level, and that starts with awareness, right? And so on an individual level, a competent therapist is aware, right? So you're willing to recognize the nuances of one's own and other cultures. You understand that racism is a system into which we are all socialized and conditioned to view white as superior. You're always working on your own assumptions. You're working on understanding your client's worldview, and you're aware of your own thoughts and feelings and how they play a role in your therapy. And you're always willing to review the scientific literature and use different approaches as necessary.
So some important definitions regarding cultural competence or cultural awareness. The first one being cultural competency. So this is an individual's ability to use academic, experiential, and interpersonal skills to increase one's understanding and appreciation of other cultures. Also, we want to bring up the idea of anti-racist. So a lot of times what people talk about is, am I racist or I am not a racist? But we want to bring up the idea of actually being anti-racist. So instead of either doing something that enacts a prejudice or kind of turning a blind eye to it, anti-racism is actually the idea or practice of promoting things that show equality and tolerance to individuals and groups, and an understanding and being supportive of the growth of culture. We also want to bring up the colorblind awareness, and Dr. Dougan talked about this a little bit before, but the idea that if an individual is colorblind, if they think or believe that they don't see color, that they are somehow not racist. But being colorblind can actually perpetuate this, because you are not being introspective to what's going on for yourself, and you're also denying things that may be going on for your client. So being aware of this idea and being able to kind of push back against it can help us have a greater cultural awareness.
Okay, so beyond the individual level, beyond awareness, what does culturally sensitive practice look like on an organizational level, right? So, and on an organizational level, you acknowledge whiteness and face up to its benefits and advantages as capital. You recognize that this is not a Black person's issue, but a human issue, right? So we all play a role, and we all need to play a role in resolving these issues if we want to be a better place, a better human. We strive to gain insight on our own biases and shortcomings as an organization and address training deficits related to diversity. We also recognize that evidence-based treatment does not work for everyone, and we're willing to try different approaches. And we have training focused on understanding clients' worldview.
So we just kind of wanted to use our practice as kind of a quick example. So one thing would be kind of like organizational change or shift in power. So within our organization, when somebody wants to contract business with us or have us assist in some way, they have to talk to both Dr. Dougan and myself. There have been people that have made the attempt to go around Dr. Dougan and talk to only me directly, and we actually have to organizationally change this so they understand that it's equitable power here. Another thing that sometimes happens is that we called our practice Dougan and Walden Wellness, and people at times will call me Dr. Dougan in the sense that they think because I'm a white male that my name came first. And so again, we have to redirect this. Also, we promote visions, or we have, like I said at the beginning, we have a vision that promotes a multicultural vision. And we also promote and see kind of diversity within our understanding in our organization. And then we also try to actively engage the community to provide access to as many people as we're able to.
Okay, so here we want to understand the culturally competent workplace and organizational change. So we're going to go back to our fictitious client, Loretta. If you remember, Loretta had come in, she had increased her drinking and wanted to address this. So, you know, initially we want to give Loretta coping skills. We want her to have the language to kind of express and understand what she's going through. But we also want to get some replacement behaviors for Loretta and empower her. And so Loretta decides that a good replacement behavior for her would be to, on evenings, instead of drinking, start looking at workplaces. And so we talk about what a workplace environment would look like, a culturally competent workplace environment. And so we would look at these three competencies, right? So Loretta would be looking for a place that has cognitive competencies, affective competencies, and behavioral competencies. And so cognitive competencies includes the ability to accurately process information regarding culturally different others and culturally different practices. So on Loretta's interview, she's going to be asking questions that's going to be, you know, kind of giving her an idea of if this place that she's interviewing with has these competencies. Affective competencies includes positive emotional responses towards culturally different others and when faced with culturally different practices. Behavioral competencies includes acting in a positive and appropriate manner when interacting with culturally diverse others. And Dr. Walden's gonna explain these in a little bit more depth.
So Lloyd and Hartel kind of broke this down a little bit. So going kind of across the top, the first four have to do with the cognitive competencies. The next four here, so from tolerance for ambiguity to the ability to understand the emotions of others, those are the affective competencies. And the last one moves to the behavioral competency. And it's a lot of information that's kind of like compressed into one slide, but to kind of give you an example of how this would work for an individual, I'm going to try to use Loretta as an example. And I'm going to kind of point out how having these competencies can really help somebody at work, not only for the individual, but also for productivity, because an organization often wants to look at how someone can be productive as possible. So Dr. Dougan talked a lot about Loretta, and so we're going to look at the ability to regulate the ability to display one's own emotions, right? So first we have to have satisfaction, right? So in one workplace, Loretta did not have satisfaction, and she's looking for somewhere where she can. Also having the affective commitment of others. Dr. Dougan talked about how individuals were leaving her out of meetings or not talking to her about things, which probably also leads into the lack of trust. Can she participate safely? Again, she doesn't feel like she can talk to individuals at work, and her drinking was increased. Also, the task orientation, right? Her goal was to increase or to move up in the company, and yet it appeared that there had been this ceiling placed there. So for her, right, the cultural competency of the organization was not there, and that ability to have that affective expression was then kind of brought down. So the affective competency was not provided for her at her job.
Okay. So, when we're talking about organizationally, a culturally competent workplace, we really want to stress that we may not have the tools to develop these things, but we really, to address these issues, but we really do need to start looking at this information, and we have to develop the tools to address the culturally competent workplace. And so this next quote is a good quote by Ridley. Unintentional behavior is perhaps the most insidious form of racism. The major challenge facing counselors is to overcome unintentional racism and provide more equitable service delivery. All right. So again, here we want to stress the importance of that evidence-based treatment does not work for everyone. Wounds occur in a socio-political context, and current PTSD treatments lack cultural relevance for most people of color. So when you're addressing racial trauma, there is research that shows, you're going to have to use a different approach. There are clear empirical evidence supporting the association between experiences with racial discrimination and behavioral health disorders. All right, and so when we're conceptualizing and challenging microaggressions and racial ideology, we have to find alternatives to the common passivities in the workplace and in behavioral health. We have to challenge and educate perpetrators and systems in place. And we have to develop strategic microinventions to make the invisible visible.
So, a lot of things written by Sue and Sue are kind of a good springboard, but here's just an example from an article from Sue in 2006. So some kind of just important highlights to point out. One is our own individual kind of self-awareness. Also the ability to kind of hypothesize what's going on for the client, being able to assess what's going on within the session. And as always, as we're doing this, a willingness to consult if needed in order to help ourselves grow as well as help our client.
Okay, and here's just some more information about conceptualizing and challenging microaggressions and racial ideologies. And one is that people of color have been dealing with racism their whole lives. So when you're addressing the issue in session or in the workplace, you don't want to address it as a new problem. You want to ask questions and don't assume. And you want to educate yourself for yourself. One of the complaints we get frequently is that some people of color have been asked to educate their white counterparts, and it's really uncomfortable and also perpetuates the racial trauma that they are experiencing. You want to have an awareness of over pathologizing, empathetic listening around microaggressions. You know, you want to make sure that you are validating experiences and not invalidating or devaluing. Understanding worldview is understand that our worldview is highly impacted by culture. So an example of this is that an internal locus of control and responsibility is most characteristic of Western counseling approaches. So just being aware of that and being willing to venture away from that in your therapy.
And Hoffman and Hoffman provides some good information around like an integrated multicultural development model. So oftentimes when clients come in, we spend time looking at like where they are as far as cultural development, but sometimes we're not introspectively looking at our own cultural development and how that transference and countertransference can impact therapy and interactions. So like, for example, a client comes in and they may be angry, right? So we may not know what to do with that anger. We might be feeling guilt or shame. And from a cultural competent perspective, this may be the client in an immersion phase and us kind of like retreating from that. Also at times, you know, we may feel like, you know, what's going on with them? This is what happened there is the client's fault. And that blaming might be a form of our own resistance, but being able to look at and integrate both our own cultural development and hypothesizing the client's cultural development can greatly assist with developing clinical interventions.
Okay, so now we're getting into barriers to addressing these issues. And one of the number one barriers to addressing some of the issues, the very important issues we brought up today, is denial. Black Lives Matter.
All lives matter.
Breast cancer awareness.
All cancers matter.
No means no.
All words matter.
Save the whales.
All mammals matter.
Denial is the heartbeat of racism, beating across ideologies, races, and nations. It's beating within us. All right, so here are some barriers to treatment. Racial and ethnic minorities are less likely to receive behavioral health treatment than white Americans. African Americans report lengthier wait periods, less initiation of treatment, more barriers to treatment participation, for example, lack of childcare, lack of insurance, and lack of knowledge about available services, and shorter lengths of stay in treatment than do white Americans. So we spoke about that earlier when we spoke about the willingness to address systemic problems. 33.5% of African Americans who had a need for substance abuse treatment did not receive it in the prior year. They reported that they lacked money or insurance coverage to pay for it. Again, system issues. African Americans and Latinos are less likely than white Americans to receive residential treatment and are more likely to receive outpatient treatment, even when they present with more serious substance use problems. Factors impacting access to behavioral health treatment includes clinicians' degree of cultural competencies and awareness, limited transition from PCP to behavioral health professionals, and limits related to behavioral health coverage.
So a lot of these kind of barriers to treatment can also show up as bias, or it can also show up as
Sorry, we got ahead of ourselves. So some more barriers to treatment include providers' understanding of cultural factors impact case conceptualization, diagnoses, and treatment planning. So historically, the behavioral health system has shown biases against African Americans. And so we spoke about this earlier as well. You know, sometimes there's a dual role, and the person providing you treatment or setting up your treatment may have to report you to your PO. African Americans, even when receiving the same amount of services as white Americans, are less likely to be satisfied with those services. And I'm sure this has to do with the mistrust of services as well and service providers. Clinicians need to improve cultural competencies in practice through the following: continued education on culturally competent practices, develop diverse treatment teams, and tailor treatment to the client, and be willing to advocate for culturally sensitive policies.
So a lot of these barriers can show up in our clinical biases, right? So when thinking about this, I think about the time that Dr. Dougan and I were working with the Department of Juvenile Justice, where when working with clients, sometimes preoccupation with outgrouping them being the residents at the facility, or them being from one part of the state or another, really kind of pushed this out-group, in-group idea, separating people who work there from the residents. Also, at times, there could be this kind of anxiety arousal or adverse arousal around being in the room with the residents, sometimes kind of based on what their convictions may be or some of their history could create this. And a lot of times these types of behaviors greatly damage the relationship between like the clinician or a caseworker working with them and the client who was seeking or needing treatment. So having kind of a more open idea, a more in-grouping kind of perspective can help reduce that biases. So to kind of reduce the bias, we want to look at one, participating kind of framework that kind of decreases this outgrouping bias, right? The more you get to know the individual, the less likely you are to outgroup an individual. Also, making sure that we're being empathetic and seeking to establish kind of a pro-social relationship with the client, and also kind of having a structured analysis of how we're hypothesizing what's going on with the client, and making sure we're looking at many of the important variables as we can to have a better understanding of what's going on. And so we're going to try to provide you like a clinical example of this. So this here is a hypothetical client, Mr. Smith, comes into treatment for the first time the age of 55. He was referred by a primary care physician, and on the intake paperwork indicated that he was seeking therapy because he was feeling worried. During that initial discussion, we find that he's had increased alcohol use over the last couple of years, and he's been having less and less social interaction. He's been isolating more. And often when we think of treatment, we're only thinking of the right hand of this slide here. But to get a better understanding of Mr. Smith, we need to look at what's going on in context, that there's an individual who's just now showing up to treatment at 55 years of age. So when we begin to talk with him more, we find that he has 4 adult sons and daughters who now live outside the home. Also, many of his friends have either been lost due to death or incarceration, so he has less social interaction. Also, kind of worrying some of these things can happen with him. We have the murder of Breonna Taylor, which impacts his concern for his grown adult daughters. We also have the incidents with George Floyd, and that not only impacts his concern for his sons outside the home, but also his own concern of interacting. And these things are continually perpetuated by the police brutality, also by other forms of oppression and poor education. So if we begin to look at this as a full dynamic experience, and again, this isn't all the factors, but ones that kind of begin to help you formulate how all these things may lead together, we can see where Mr. Smith's worry may be coming from and conceptualize the alcohol use and the isolation as more than just 2 sets of behaviors, but a dynamic set of what's going on for him.
So we are close to wrapping up, but before we wrap up, we do want to go over some barriers to moving forward. And so denial, as we spoke of earlier, perpetuates trauma. Right? Racism can be looked at as a virus that mutates and has mutated into more covert forms that support the more overt forms. Having an oversimplified definition of racism, right? So the dichotomy in thinking that only bad or immoral people can be racist can also be a barrier to moving forward, because if you're not identifying yourself as supporting racist ideas, then we can't address that. Failure to identify white supremacy and the culture that we live in. The separation of politics and behavioral health, despite the impact of politics on behavioral health. Unwillingness to understand modern forms of racism. And participation in defensive moves as a means to silence and keep a comfortable equilibrium. So again, denial is an important one here, but there are also some other defensive moves that you can get more information on through reading White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo. And then she also discusses the concept of objectivity that tells us it's possible to be free from race and bias, and the importance of recognizing, again, racism as a system that we're all socialized into.
So when we started today, we had some objectives, and I hope that you're going to be taking some things away. And we want to come back to this idea of not just being racist or not racist, but actually becoming anti-racist. And so before you started this presentation today at 3:00, if you were beginning to ask yourself or thinking to yourself, I hope this presentation will just end early so that I can get off work early today. Maybe you were avoidant. We would consider this to be in the fear zone. And I hope after having this conversation with us, that you can maybe have identified some things that you have learned, something that you understand and has gotten you thinking about becoming anti-racist. If you came in today with some ideas and you were jotting down these ideas as we were talking through different points, I hope you're able to take some of these ideas and begin to use them, moving from learning to actual growth. And if today you've already started implementing some culturally competent ideas, I hope that we've added some new ideas so that you can continue to grow and move on. And remember that this idea of being anti-racist isn't stagnant, but something that we're all continuing to work on and move through. So thank you for listening to us today, and we appreciate you participating in this uncomfortable conversation with us.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, sorry about that. Thank you again, Dr. Dougan and Dr. Walden, for your presentation. Very thought-provoking and well-informed. And we have several questions that have come in. If you have time, I can go through several of them.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. What is the difference between space racism and gentrification?
That would be you. I think that it would be very similar. You know, I think that they're very relatable concepts. Gentrification is a form of space racism, in my opinion. I don't know, Dr. Walden, how do you feel about that?
Yeah, I mean, they're very similar in nature. I don't necessarily know that operationally that there's much of a difference there.
Okay, in the reference on the slide with Black Lives Matters, there was a quote that stated, "Black anger was not a legitimate response to racial terror and violence." Can you talk a little bit more about Black anger and it not being a legitimate response, and in what way?
So that bullet on that slide was discussing concepts that are related to the Black Lives Matter resistance, right? So what we were saying with that bullet is that there is a concept that Black anger is not a legitimate response to violence against Blacks or police brutality. Right. So we weren't actually making that statement. We were saying that that's the concept. That's a concept that is related to that is a reason why people may have a resistance to the Black Lives Matter movement. Did I answer the question? Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you. We'll let you know if they chat back in.
Okay.
Thank you.
Mhm.
A third question, these disparities between the oppressed and the depression are both embedded in the DNA. How can we change something that is so rooted in us all?
Yes. And
No, go ahead.
so and I think that awareness, we have to start with awareness of that and just be willing to look at that and be reflective about that and see how these embedded natures, because how it plays a role in your service delivery and in your interactions with people. Because we're not going to be able to overcome it, right? Everyone is socialized to believe white is superior. And so even as African Americans, African Americans struggle with that as well, and so it's just something that we have to continue to work towards. It may not be in our lifetime where it becomes more natural to believe that we're all equal and act as though we're all equal, but it's something that we want to strive towards.
And Kendi points out in his book that the actual construct of racism and white superiority is only a little over like 400 years old. It was actually constructed in Europe, kind of in the early days of European and American slavery, basically to legitimize it. So prior to that, this idea of white superiority wasn't even formed. So we spent hundreds to thousands of years as cultures without racism. We actually constructed it not all that long ago. So there was actually a pretty solid period of time when it wasn't there. So just as it was enacted, if we push back against it, we can like disavow it.
Thank you. Okay, we have another question. A client had a customer at work disrespect him due to his race. He doesn't want to lose his job by being aggressive back at his response. So what would be a good thing to tell this client about how to handle such a situation? So just walking away to this client felt like he was accepting the bad treatment.
Yeah, and one of the things that I have recognized in my own work with people who are experiencing racism is just having their experience validated, right? Their experience, having the verbiage and the language to talk about what they're experiencing will help. In terms of what to do, You may look at ways to help empower your client, and maybe looking at ways to get support from his place of employment, in regards to what can he feasibly do in that situation, without being at risk for losing his job, and some other strategies that they can take, because a lot of these places have um, you know teams that work on how you can deal with disgruntled workers, but they don't specify what to do in the case of race-related issues. And so maybe that is something that he could address with his place of employment.
Thank you. Could Dr. Dougan and Dr. Walden provide their clinical opinion on the idea that racism and other forms of extreme prejudice are symptoms of a personality disorder?
I'm glad you said personal opinion, right? Because that's exactly what it is. And so I liken it to, I think a personality disorder is a good way to conceptualize it. But when we get that question in regards to how do you challenge racism in your session, or how do you challenge racist ideas, or do we have a right to? I often say, well, racist ideas can lead to racist actions, right? Just as if you had someone who had pedophilic ideas, that could lead to pedophilic actions. And so I look at it as, an obligation to, protect the community when, someone has a racist idea that could possibly lead to racist action.
And I'm very spatial, so like the slide with the conceptualization of the client, but I often conceptualize it that way even for a client that has these racist tendencies that come up. And so for personality wise, right, like I'm trying to figure out for them, where's this coming from, right? Is it a familial thing? Does it come down generation to generation? Is it something about interactions that are going on? And a lot of times for individuals, it has either one to do with a perception that I've worked with, a perception of scarcity of believed resource, right? Like they think that something's either going to happen to their home, their environment, their job, or they have this perceived paranoia of in-grouping and out-grouping individuals. And so actually working with them actually not only helps the individual decrease their own distress, but often it helps the community at large, hopefully.
Thank you. Can you talk a little bit about white savior complex?
Yeah, I think that should be your question.
Like I don't like what about
remember
it?
when we were talking about that movie Blindside?
Yeah. Right, but like what, like just talk about white savior complex in general? Like
yeah.
I believe so.
The capacity that we've talked about it is like maybe like in the media, right? So when we were talking about, when we discussed like dehumanization and all the different forms that people can express anti-blackness, what we see in the media is this reflection of the Black person as a savage, or we will also see this other extreme where you might see them being saved by the white person. And so we see this in there was the controversy around the movie Avatar, right? And we see this in the movie Blindside. And so I think it's just another concept to kind of think about, like, what we see in terms and what is portrayed out there in regards to, you know, Black people and our abilities and, you know, what we can accomplish and how we are. You know, we're needing to be saved. We're needing to some sort of assistance, you know, and the Afro pessimism, we kind of talked about this, the, you know, the beliefs of the dominant culture is better and it will help us, you know, those types of things.
Thank you. Couple more questions?
Sure.
Yep, okay. How would you handle if you think a client is experiencing trauma from racism and mistrusting of me as a white therapist? How would you bring up the subject?
Can you repeat that? I didn't
Sure.
I didn't follow all the way through.
Sure. How would you handle it if you think a client is experiencing trauma from racism and mistrusting of me as a white therapist? How would you bring up the subject?
Right. And so I think we had a similar question in the last presentation. And so I think that, again, one of the things that's really important for a client who's experiencing any sort of discrimination is the validation of that experience and bringing it up as a white prejudice, a white therapist rather. You know, I think it's all in the way you present it, you know. If you ask the question and you're not forcing the issue on someone and you just sort of explore, you know, if it could be that, I think that would actually be a really refreshing thing for a client to have, is the option to pick, am I going through this? You know?
Thank you. Okay, I think we have one more.
Okay.
I recognize that I have benefited from I recognize that I have benefited from quite a few privileges. I would like to know what other resources are available to promote continued personal growth in the area of anti-racism.
Yeah. So I think we had somebody kind of bring this up similarly last time, and so what we've done, like within our clinic, and if you'd like, we can share with you guys, and if you're able to like distribute it, then we can do that. Is like we've started collectively bringing together in like a Excel type spreadsheet all of the information. One, because we're all distance, so like then this way it's available at a distance, but also it's living, right? It's not something that's just a closed document that something's printed off and somebody's had. But as we gain more and more information and more resources, it's good. Plus, individuals gain information differently. So there's book lists and journals and videos and TED Talks on there now. And sure, I'm missing some other types of media form on which information has been gathered. But that can be very helpful in gaining that. Some of the some of the big ones that I liked myself was D'Angelo's books.
White Fragility.
White Fragility, thank you. And also another one that I liked was The Color of Law. I think were good ones, but Dougan may have other ones.
Yeah, I mean, the two that I recommend people start with is How to Be an Anti-Racist by Ibram X. Kendi and White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo. I think it gives you two really good perspectives in regards to the issue.
Wonderful. Well, thank you both, Dr. Dougan and Dr. Walden, so much. I think this was just a wonderful presentation and encouraging us in how to implement culturally humble practices. I also want to give a shout out to our Support Act grant team for pulling this training together. And then again, thank you all, our participants. I think Dr. Dougan and Dr. Walden, I think you hit over 1,300 in these two trainings. And so it was very valuable. And I hope that it's impacting the health, behavioral health, and substance use disorder treatment is being implemented in the Commonwealth. So thank you all again. And also just want to remind folks that this presentation, as well as a recording, will be posted on our Support Act grant page, and Jason has put that link in our chat box. And again, thank you both.
Yeah, and we just really wanted to say thank you as well, and how grateful we are, especially reaching such a large amount of people. And also want to thank Simone, our administrative staff, that picked all the images. It really brought our presentation to life, and we couldn't have done that without her. Yeah, so thank you.
Thank you.